On my birthday, a ribboned box arrived at my door, dark chocolate dusted with gold, the kind you save for a quiet night. I brewed tea, set out the good plate, and almost took a bite. Almost. You learn as a woman of a certain age to read the space between words, the eager call asking if I'd enjoyed the treat, the way silence swells when you say you haven't. A mother's heart wants to believe, a woman's gut keeps the receipt. That evening, I carried the sweets to the little ones, because sharing felt kinder than indulging. Hours later, sirens stitched the dark. Doctors whispered about toxins. Somewhere between the beep of monitors and the chill of a hospital corridor, the truth unclasped itself slow and merciless. The gift wasn't sweet. It was a goodbye dressed in ribbon. And the person who chose it knew exactly what I loved. Tell me, what would you do when love tastes like arsenic now? I'm a mother of 40 years. Lunches packed, bills stretched, birthdays patched together with grocery store candles, and the belief love could fill the cracks. I adopted a boy who needed shelter and swore I'd be both roof and harbor, even when the weather turned. Gray hair doesn't end lessons. I've learned silence speaks, gratitude thins, and devotion can tighten like a leash. Survival looks like common sense. Check the locks, keep receipts, share the sweets. I almost died for loving without limits. The box was elegant matte paper satin ribbon, each chocolate on a little throne. A card. To the best mother ink bleeding at the heart. I set it on the mantel as proof kindness still lived. Boiled tea, laid out the good plate, promised myself a taste. Later. I wanted to believe a ribbon could hold a family together. It couldn't. That birthday taught me the necessary mercy of limits. I share the good things first. Cake before frosting flowers, split between tables. Chocolates passed to small hands because joy grows when it's shared. I tucked the card back under the ribbon, drove to Megan's, and let the little ones choose the shiniest pieces. Megan thanked me in that careful, tired voice. I told myself I was laying a sugar bridge. I didn't know it then, but that habit kept me safe. At dawn, the phone jittered. His voice tried casual and came out crooked. Had I eaten any even one? I said no, I'd given them to the kids, and the line filled with breathing and urgency. You're absolutely sure? Then a rush, he had to go work, calling click. I stood over cooling tea, wondering why a gift needed a deadline, why sweetness was suddenly in a hurry unless it was hiding something sharp. That silence did not end with the call. It followed me like a draft through the house. Women my age recognize it, the pause after your answer, when someone calculates rather than cares. I poured the tea down the sink and opened the window even though the morning was cold. I wanted air, I wanted noise, I wanted anything but that echoing quiet where fear multiplies. I told myself not to be dramatic. I told myself he was tired, overworked, worried about something ordinary. But my hands would not stop their small tremor, and my mouth tasted like metal. I dialed back and reached voicemail. I left a message about stopping by later, about soup and a quick visit. No reply. The quiet became a weight, and every minute grew a new question. When did gifts begin to worry me? When did apologies start arriving in boxes I kept busy? Which is another word for scared. I folded towels, counted pills. Watched the clock bruise the long morning into pale hours. 40 years is a long time to practice hope. I raised Ethan the way a lighthouse burns steady. Even when no one is looking. Even when the fog refuses to lift. There were rent envelopes that scared me. Winter coats bought from thrift stores, and birthdays stretched with paper crowns and spaghetti. I taught him to say, please, to hold doors to call when he was late. I thought love plus structure made character the way flour and water make bread. Maybe it still does for some. For us, it created a script I could not stop reading. I played the giver. He played the child long after childhood ended. I would send food, slide a bill into his pocket, pretend not to notice when gratitude vanished. A mother's heart memorizes excuses like hymns. I told myself the world was hard on young men. That time would soften his edges. I did not see how easily kindness becomes currency, and how debts form quietly where gratitude should have lived instead. When he married Megan, I hoped sharing would multiply. Love again, more chairs at the table, more voices in the kitchen, holidays with extra pies cooling on the counter. Instead, something thinned, visits shortened, texts turned practical then sparse. I tried to be the helpful kind of mother, the one who drops groceries, bites her tongue, offers childcare, and leaves before opinions spill. I told myself adjustment takes time, that new marriages feel protective, that two people build walls to keep the world out and do not realize who they are walling in. Megan was never cruel. She was careful. Careful is its own distance. I learned to read the polite smile, the doorway conversations, the not today messages. I did not want to compete, so I folded myself smaller. When you shrink, you think you are making peace. Often you are making room for disrespect. I kept bringing casseroles and hope, pretending not to notice the drafts. Politeness covered cracks that only mothers measure in nights in aching quiet. I believed generosity could stitch anything. If a visit felt tense, I brought flowers. If the air cooled, I warmed it with soup. Babysitting rides to appointments, a little envelope tucked in a coat. I told myself resentment melts when it meets abundance, that people soften around those who give. Maybe they do. Maybe they also learn they never need to ask what it costs you. I had a rule, do not keep score. It kept me kind and it kept me blind. When good intentions become routine, they stop feeling like gifts and start reading like dues. I did not notice when my help became expected, when gratitude turned into timing, when requests arrived like calendar reminders. Love felt like labor with no payday. Still, I doubled down because women my age believe effort pays off if you just reach deeper. I kept reaching. I did not realize I was handing over the scissors. You cannot sow trust while someone quietly measures your seams for their perfect cut later. It did not happen with shouting. It was the softer kind of undoing, the way a comment lands and pretends to be concern. Little things like jokes about how I hover tips, about boundaries tucked into conversations, about preschool schedules, advice columns forwarded at midnight. I would find myself defending choices I had never been asked about. I told myself I was sensitive, that I needed thicker skin, that modern families have new language for old courtesies. But the air shifted. Invitations came later. Updates arrived after the fact. I stopped holding the baby first. I started waiting to be told where to sit. There is a way respect erodes that looks polite. You can miss it if you are still arranging napkins and smiling for pictures. I kept smoothing tablecloths while little drafts slipped around my ankles. By then, I had learned to ignore chills. That is how women my age get sick without noticing we keep serving. Service blinds the eyes that should be counting small cuts daily. The night before everything snapped into place was almost annoyingly normal. I watered the plant. I always forget, wiped the counters twice, folded dish towels into neat thirds, and set out tomorrow's mug beside the kettle. I watched a show where people renovate strangers' kitchens and convinced myself satisfaction looks like recessed lighting. I called a friend, left a cheerful voicemail, and did not mention the strange phone call. I am good at not worrying other people. I washed my face. I checked the doors. I turned the box around on the counter so the ribbon faced the window, a small parade for no one. The house hummed with familiar noises, refrigerator old pipes, the upstairs neighbor walking heavy at 9. I held the card again to the best mother and touched the ink where it had bled. It is easy to believe what you need when you are tired. I went to bed and slept like I had not set the stage. The morning would unspool every quiet lie I'd kept. I slept under a blanket, my hands had mended, unaware I had handed danger to children I love. That is the worst part to admit. I thought I was doing the right thing, modeling generosity, bridging a gap I could not name. I drifted in and out of the kind of sleep older women know light alert, still listening for babies who are now taller than us. Somewhere before dawn, I dreamed of a table set for Sunday steam rising from cups, a place card with my name centered and safe. I woke before the alarm held by habit. The house felt ordinary, and so did I. I made the bed, smoothed the pillow like we do for visitors, and opened the curtains to a pale sky. The phone sat quiet on the counter, and the box looked harmless in the new light. I did not yet know that love had almost cost lives. Ignorance can look like peace when the room is tidy and bright, until sirens rewrite the morning. Dawn stretched thin across the sink when the second call came, the one that moved fast and used words that do not belong to birthdays. There were children throwing up a drive to the hospital, a strange smell from the chocolates someone had already tasted. I pressed the phone between my ear and shoulder and found my keys with hands that suddenly felt clumsy. At the hospital, the waiting room clock ticked like a metronome I could not silence. A doctor used the word toxin. Someone wrote down arsenic. My world tilted, and yet everything kept behaving like morning coffee machines, sputtering sneakers, squeaking automatic doors, sighing open and shut. I stood there, a woman who had given the wrong gift, a mother who had trusted ribbon over instinct. The truth did not explode. It arrived steady and merciless. This was never sweetness. This was intent. And intent, whereas familiar handwriting answers kindly on birthdays, and asks careful questions about whether you have tasted anything yet. Before hanging up too quickly, the phone rang before the sun got over the roofline voice, still thick with morning. He asked about the chocolates, the way people ask about the weather when they've already checked the forecast. I could hear the edge under the politeness, something too interested in something that should have been small. I told him I hadn't had time yet, that the ribbon was still on, that I planned to sit down with tea and do it right. There was a beat, the kind that lives longer than a second, and I felt my shoulders rise, like I could dodge whatever came next. He cleared his throat, said he had to jump on a call, but he'd check back. It is strange the way a simple question can rearrange the furniture in your chest. I kept telling myself it's ordinary, a son asking his mother about a gift. But even ordinary turns peculiar when it arrives too early, too eager. As if sweetness had an expiration date I wasn't meant to outlast. I called back to say I'd try one later, and he picked up on the first ring, all breath and gravel, pressing me for details I didn't have. So you haven't tasted anything. Not even a corner. You're sure I said I was sure. And tried to laugh small and friendly the way mothers do when they want to take heat out of a room. He did not laugh back. He changed subjects like a man reversing down a narrow driveway, work deadlines, a meeting he'd forgotten, traffic on the FDR. Then he hung up so quickly I could hear the empty room echo. Panic leaves fingerprints even through the phone. It smudges words. It pulls the courtesy out of them. I stood in my kitchen holding the handset like a relic and thought about the box I'd passed on. For the first time, I felt grateful for the habit people have teased me about always sharing the best part before I take any for myself. Megan's number lit the screen an hour later, her voice thin and too bright, that tone women use when they're trying not to scare the person they love. She said the little ones had been up sick, that one felt dizzy and the other complained of a strange taste. They were driving to Staten Island, the hospital near her sister's. I heard road noise, a child's cry, and a muffled apology that wasn't meant for me. My mouth said I'm on my way, before my mind finished the sentence. I grabbed my purse keys, the cardigan I always forget, and drove like memory slow, where the cops sit fast, where it opens, praying at yellow lights, the way believers do without thinking. At the ER, I found her on plastic chairs, color gone. From her face, hands moving in small circles over a backpack. Triage swallowed us, then questions, then forms. A nurse asked about the chocolates. I said yes, I'd brought them. Saying it felt like pushing a stone uphill, I had lifted myself. They took blood whispered in that professional hush hospitals use, to keep panic from flowering, and moved us to a room with paper sheets that crinkled. A doctor with soft hands said they'd found concerning markers trace elements that don't belong in children. He didn't say the word at first. He said toxin. He said contaminant. He said further analysis. My mind did its old tricks. Maybe a nut allergy. Maybe a bad batch. Maybe I was making too much of it the way people say older women do. But then he wrote a word on a clipboard so we would not have to hear it the first time. Arsenic. Even printed it rang. I stared at the letters and thought how something invisible can posture as sweetness and still choose a body like a target. Megan squeezed my wrist. Somewhere in the hallway, a vending machine ate someone's dollar, and the small curse that followed felt like the only normal sound for miles. Fear is a practical thing at my age. It counts pills, labels, spices, keeps spare keys with a neighbor, and batteries lined up like soldiers. But this fear had teeth. It bit through routine and asked for names. I sat in a chair that was too low and thought about how easily love camouflages danger, how ribbon blinds. I wanted to scream. I wanted to serve coffee. I wanted to rewind to the moment where I could throw that box away and replace it with a tin of butter cookies that only pretend to be special. Instead, I breathed and did the next right thing. I wrote down Time's symptoms, names of staff, anything that might matter later. Megan looked at me like I was the adult in the room, which I suppose I was, and my stomach twisted with the guilt of a gift misfired. I did not yet dare say what my gut had started to say. Someone meant for something to end, and not the evening. He called again, voice low, as if secrecy could contain consequence. The questions cut closer now. Not a single bite. You didn't lick a finger. You didn't swallow by accident. I answered like a witness, precise, and asked why he kept checking. He said habit. He said he cared about my sugar. He said a dozen things that pressed forward but never sat still. I had answered the same way when he was a child and lost a toy patient, repetitive hiding my worry, so his wouldn't grow. Now I heard what my patients had trained him to expect compliance without clarity. I said we were at the hospital. I said the kids were being checked. There was a scraping sound on his end, like a chair pushed fast, and then a clipped goodbye that left me colder than the air conditioning. When your child rushes off while your grandchildren are in triage, you learn something you cannot unknow. Panic can be careful. Guilt can be purposeful. Cowardice always hangs up first. In the quiet that followed, the mind does what it does with fragments. It makes a picture, his early call, the urgency about a treat. My habit of sharing the little ones, choosing the shiniest first. His panic when I said I hadn't tasted. The way politeness had replaced warmth inch by inch this past year. I remembered the ink bleeding on the card and how I had read haste as emotion instead of pressure. I remembered a dinner last month where he tracked the bill more than the conversation. The puzzle wasn't finished, but the edge pieces were down. Women like me collect evidence the way we fold laundry, automatic, careful, precise. I began a list in my head of what to tell a doctor, a cop, a lawyer, if it came to that. The word lawyer made my chest ache. We raise children to choose us. We forget they can choose other things. Betrayal isn't a thunderclap. It's a drip that finally fills the glass and tips it over the edge. A question arrived I hated myself for asking. Why did it sound like he was relieved I hadn't eaten? What kind of relief lives in the shadow of your mother's survival? My heart, stubborn as ever, tried to build alibis for him. Faster than my mind could dismantle them. Maybe a friend sent the box. Maybe there was a mix-up. Maybe the brand had a recall. I clung to the soft maybes and watched them tear. Relief makes sense only if danger met the wrong mouth. The thought lodged like a shard. I stood to shake it loose and nearly sat back down. The hospital's fluorescent lighting does not forgive. It makes every truth sharper. I looked at Megan at the kids sleeping in the aftermath of medicine and decided to test the most basic instinct I had, follow the heat source. Trouble runs downhill to its easiest shelter. If he wasn't answering me, he would be answering someone else. Someone who always says yes. It is amazing what the body remembers when the mind resists. I saw all at once the pattern I had been smoothing over holidays where he left early, hugs that stopped landing, updates offered like obligations, how his eyes drifted to my purse when the check arrived. Visits counted by errands, not by stories. The way he harvested my time, the way you harvest mint. Casually, greedily, because it keeps growing back. A mother recognizes draft long before the weather changes. I had been ignoring the cold. The last time he dropped by, he called from the driveway instead of the door, as if I were a service and not a home. I had told myself modern life was busy. Modern life is always busy, but love finds a chair. I touched the place on my forearm where a small bruise had bloomed last week, from bumping a cupboard and thought some marks happen inside, and our mirrors are too kind to show them. 40 years is enough time to confuse charity with virtue, and endurance with love. I had told myself not keeping score made me generous, but it only made me forget to count myself. What is the point where giving becomes erasure, where patience becomes permission? If you spend long enough being needed, you forget how to be valued. I sat there in that chair asking questions. I had scolded younger women for asking, and I felt the kind of old that has nothing to do with birthdays. I was raised to believe motherhood is a vow you keep, even when it keeps you small. But vows do not require blindness. I thought back to the first time I drew a boundary and apologized for it in the same breath. I remembered how quickly my apology was accepted and how thoroughly the boundary was ignored. Limits aren't unloving. Limits are lamps. Without them, you walk in the dark and call it devotion until you hit something that breaks. I have always known where he runs when trouble curls around his ankles. There's a door that has never closed to his flaws. A living room that keeps a soft blanket for his excuses, Linda's house. She has loved him as if love could outvote consequence, and I can't blame her for that. We built that idol together. He learned early that if one of us said no, the other would say not yet. Which to a boy like him sounded exactly the same as yes. My gut pointed down that familiar street. I told Megan I was stepping out, kissed the kid's hair, left my number with the nurse, and walked into the day that had stopped pretending to be ordinary. On the drive, the skyline looked like set dressing for a play I didn't audition for, and the radio couldn't find a song that didn't sound like warning. A woman at any age knows the place her questions will be answered. I turned toward it. I drove the long way not to waste time, but to gather courage. The car smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee, the scent of errands and caretaking the air. Women live in when their lives become the net under everyone else's falls. My hands were steady on the wheel, but the small muscles in my jaw had locked. Faith is a lovely word until it meets proof. Mine had been dented all morning, and now it rattled. I pictured the box again, the gold dust, the card bleeding at the curve of the heart. I pictured the doctor's clipboard, the word no one wants written beside children's names. I promised myself I would not scream, would not plead, would not barter with the unthinkable. I would ask, I would listen, I would record what the truth sounded like in daylight. By the time I turned onto Linda's street, my kindness had put on shoes with stronger heels. Tenderness can ride shotgun. Today, vigilance was driving. Linda opened the door with that soft, busy smile she wears when she's about to excuse anything. Behind her, the house smelled like lemon cleaner and old roses, the kind of place where forgiveness lives in the curtains. He was there, posture loose, eyes not meeting mine. A man practicing casual. The living room had a blanket. Folded on the arm of the couch, a mug half-full sanctuary, laid out like a set, he could wander into whenever consequences chased too close. I stepped past Linda's murmured welcomes and stood where the light could find his face. "We need to talk," I said, and Linda's hands fluttered, ushering us toward diplomacy. He offered a shrug that played at confusion. I let the silence expand until it made a shape we'd both have to step around. When lies arrive, they don't slam, they seep. I could feel them already damp at the baseboards. "Start with the box," I said. He stared at the floorboards as if they might offer a truer story than he planned to tell. Why I asked the simplest question in any language, the one that sounds like begging when asked by a mother. He lifted his eyes and let the mask fall, because cruelty is in the end easier than theater. Money, he said a single word with the weight of a wrecking ball. It wasn't a confession as much as an accounting entry. Tidy, efficient, bloodless. He spoke about numbers the way some men talk about weather, inevitable and no one's fault. He said things were tight, that timing had gotten bad, that I had more than I needed, and he had less than he deserved. My name did not appear in the sentence where he explained the math of my absence. He called it practical. He called it fair. There is a tone people use when they have already decided you are a resource, not a relationship. He used it fluently like a native. I felt something old inside me sit down and refuse to play along. He unspooled the rest with a clipped efficiency that made my skin go cold. Debts that had bred more debts, men who don't send reminders so much as warnings balances do, that multiplied while he performed being fine. He described an exit that would look like mercy, a quiet evening, a gentle passing, no mess, nothing dramatic. He spoke of my death like a logistics plan, and Linda, God, help us both, tried to pad the edges with soft noises as if tone could sand down intent. He said he needed what would eventually be his. He said waiting was a luxury he did not have. He said love meant understanding, by which he meant surrender. I watched his mouth form the phrases and wondered how many times I had taught him to make ugliness sound reasonable. There are murders designed as courtesies. He thought he'd invented one. The worst part was how ordinary his face looked while he said it, like a man negotiating a cable bill. It is a special kind of cruelty to listen to your child discuss dosage. He said he'd read he had planned, he'd chosen the pretty distraction that would carry the bitter through. He used words like enough and undetectable, and something in my chest tried to rise and stop him with hands that had once buttoned his coat. My ears did a strange thing. They narrowed as if focus could protect me from meaning. I saw the box again, the gold dust, the card, and the scene rearranged into its true form. I thought of the little ones' mouths stained with sweetness, and the room tilted. Linda whispered his name like it could wake him from himself. He didn't hear her. He was busy explaining how he had timed the delivery, how he had called to confirm the outcome, how my habit of sharing had rewritten his plan. It is terrible to realize that the thing you love most about yourself, your open hand, became the detail that saved your life. My heart cracked in a clean, echoing way, the kind of break that doesn't scream. It made space for thinking. I set the pieces down where I could see them and reached for the part of me that knows how to manage a crisis, the woman who kept the lights on, who found rent in pockets of coats, who learned to keep her voice level while the world tilted. I watched his jaw, the pulse in his neck, the way his fingers tapped when he got to the part where I didn't die. Anger came sharp and bright, asking to be loud. I told it to wait. There are moments when fury is a luxury you cannot afford. What I needed was precision. What I needed was proof. What I needed was to leave this house with more than outrage. I smoothed my coat like I was smoothing a tablecloth before serving tea and told myself this was a table and I would set it with facts he could not clear away. While he paced, I reached into my purse for a lip balm and found the small device I had tucked there months ago after a scare in the neighborhood. A habit born from late-night walks and long waits for buses. My fingers moved without drama. I clicked once. The little red light hid beneath my palm. I set the purse on the sofa near him, a casual placement, and said nothing. I asked him to start at the beginning, and he obliged with a zeal that still surprises me. Some people mistake confession for control. They think narrating their harm absolves it. He liked the sound of his own cleverness. I let him talk. I asked small questions and let him fill the space. Linda watched us like a person watching a storm choose a direction. I wondered as he detailed his plan whether he had ever noticed how thoroughly I once believed in him, and how thoroughly he now believed I would not fight back. Belief is dangerous in both directions. When the story shifted to blame, it arrived on cue. He gestured toward the ceiling, toward fate, toward me. "You always have to share," he said like it was a character flaw, a kink in the wire he had accounted for, but not forgiven. "You always have to make everything about the kids." He said it with the disgust of a man criticizing someone for breathing too loudly, as if generosity were an offense against efficiency. I let him spend himself on complaint until the words grew thin and his voice hoarsened. There is a point in every monologue where truth shows its seams. He reached it when he said with a kind of exhausted contempt that none of this would have happened if I had just eaten what was meant for me. I looked at him and thought not for the first time how criminals like to pretend victims misbehave. It comforts them. It keeps their mirrors kind. Standing there, I understood something I had suspected, and not yet named kindness without limits is self-erasure. I had given in every direction, assuming the world would respect my emptiness the way I respected others' needs. Instead, my largesse became a map for harm, a set of instructions on how to take from me without complaint. I realized how often I had apologized for my boundaries, how often I had removed them to prove my love. In that living room with Linda's good lamp showing the dust in the air, I chose a different lesson. Love is not the opposite of limits. Love is what limits protect. I thought of the little ones asleep on plastic pillows hours earlier and felt my spine acquaint itself with steel I hadn't needed in years. The room did not change. I did. The version of me that hovered, that pleaded, that negotiated with disrespect, she stepped back. A woman with better math stepped forward. I walked out of Linda's house into a day that had not asked for any of this and found it waiting anyway. The air felt newly useful. I stood on the porch for a long breath, the kind you keep for grief and childbirth, then descended the steps like they were counting me into the next chapter. I did not look back to see if anyone followed, because I was done being followed. The car door closed with a sound that pleased me, certain final practical. I sat and let the wheel be a wheel and not a railing. I have always believed in second chances, but second chances belong to people who do not aim their first chance at your heart. I thought about tea, about the good plate, about the card bleeding ink, and permitted myself a single small cry that did not smudge my resolve. Then I wiped my face, checked the red light on the device, and turned it off. It had heard enough. Now someone else needed to. I called Alan from the driver's seat. He answered on the second ring with the calm of a man who files chaos alphabetically. "I need a strategy," I said, and my voice surprised me, steady, almost cool. I told him the headlines, not the poetry a gift. A plan, a recording children in a hospital room, a son who did his own math. He did not interrupt. He asked for times names, details whether the device captured dates. He said not to send anything by text, to come by with the file to breathe, to drink water, to keep my sentences short, to anyone who wasn't him or a doctor. He used words like chain of custody and protective order, and the vocabulary steadied me the way knowing streets steadies you after getting lost. We set a time. He told me I wasn't alone. I had been alone for a long time without noticing. I noticed now, and the noticing itself felt like a kind of rescue. Next, I called Mark. He used to wear a badge. Now he wears a skepticism that serves just as well. I said I needed the truth about numbers, debts, habits, the shape of a hole a man digs when he stops believing in mourning. Mark asked me 3 questions that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with pattern. Then he said he'd start with casinos, move to back rooms, follow the skid marks. "He's going to be messy," Mark said, and I could hear him pulling a notebook closer. Messy is evidence that forgot to hide. We set a second time. He told me to keep receipts I didn't know I was keeping yet. He told me to rest if I could. Rest is a word that rattles around in a woman like me. It rarely lands. Still, I promised to try. I hung up and stared at my hands on the steering wheel. They looked like my mother's hands. They also looked ready. Before I started the engine, I said the quietest goodbye I have ever said to the version of me that accepted crumbs and called it faith to the mother who covered for a grown man's choices, by calling them missteps to the woman who thought endurance alone could mother a person into decency. I did not hate her. She got me this far, but she could not take me the rest of the way. I straightened my shoulders and felt the shift, like a coat removed after a very long winter. The street was the same. I was not. From here on, I would count costs before paying them. I would put my name in the sentences I write about my life. I would call things what they are, even when the words sting. I am a mother, yes, and I am also a woman whose life is her own. I turned the key, checked my mirrors, and merged into traffic, with both hands steady and my eyes exactly where they belonged. Mark's report arrived in a manila envelope, thick with photographs and the kind of printouts that smell faintly of toner and trouble. Atlantic City cameras caught him losing small bills that grew into large ones. Queen's back rooms showed him at tables where smiles looked like debts coming due. There were ATM withdrawals at odd hours, checks that bounced, and then pretended they hadn't cash advances stacked like bad decisions and texts. To men who use first names only, he had moved money between accounts the way a child shuffles cups in a street trick, hoping I'd watch the wrong hand. He had told Megan about delayed reimbursements, told Linda about market fluctuations, told me almost nothing at all except that things were fine. Fine had been feeding on us for months. Mark circled numbers in red and wrote dates that lined up with my memory like teeth. It was a lattice of lies sturdy from repetition. The picture it made didn't surprise me. What did was how relieved I felt to finally have paper that matched my gut. Alan began with the locks most people never see. Forms, filings, quiet orders that tiptoe into banks before breakfast. We made a list of every account I controlled and the ones he suspected I didn't know I controlled because my name sat in a database he'd once been asked to help with. I signed initialed handed-over statements I had kept half from habit and half from a superstition that someday they'd matter. That day had arrived. We retitled the certificates, contacted brokerages, and moved anything liquid out of casual reach. Then Alan went hunting for the thin threads Ethan had tied to me. Small authorizations, a stale power of attorney. The kind of signatures exhausted women grant to keep the peace and forget to revisit. We revoked, rescinded, recorded. The language felt like closing windows before a storm. He filed for a temporary freeze on Ethan's assets pending civil action, and I felt a shift inside me, a recalibration I could protect what I had built, including myself. Security. I learned starts as a sentence. Before the courthouse, I went to a salon, not the fancy one with cucumber water and gossip, but a quiet place where women remap themselves in the mirror. Camille asked, "What do you want to see?" when you look up, and I said, "The woman who survived her own kindness." She pushed her glasses up, studied my face like a project worth doing right, and cut away years that weren't age so much as resignation. Brown softened to something richer, length gave way to shape I'd have to own. She found the line of my jaw I had not seen since I mistook tolerance for love. We picked a jacket with a shoulder that stood up straight and shoes that did not apologize for height. I left with hair that swung like punctuation and a spine that matched it. People pretend transformation is vanity. Sometimes it's armor. When your reflection agrees with your resolve, you stop negotiating with rooms that asked you to be less. The next time he saw me, I wanted the outside to testify. I chose an art opening because spectacle has its own gravity, and I was tired of being pulled into his. A gallery's light is ruthless. It shows fingerprints and truths. I entered on a small breath and the click of heels I had not worn in years. He was there practicing affluence, laughing with a man whose watch could pay the mortgage he'd lost. He almost didn't recognize me, almost. Recognition slid across his face like a shadow when clouds pass. I didn't wait for him to approach. I closed the distance because I am done being an endpoint. Up close, I saw the tiredness money problems carve, and the anger that follows when the world refuses to pay the bill you wrote without asking. Enjoying the work I asked, and he swallowed the reflex to call me Mom because the audience had changed. Always, he said, and his eyes flicked to my hair, my posture, the fact of me. Sometimes presence is its own statement. I stood there long enough to make him feel seen. Then I let him hear me. I said I was retiring, and he tried to smile like a man who supports women's choices. From what he asked, and I let the room carry my answer farther than my voice could. From unlimited giving, I said, from financing other people's comfort with my silence. His friends found interest elsewhere. Even art prefers authenticity. He started to explain how generosity is noble, how he had always admired my heart. I pictured a ledger, the one where my name showed in the debit column, and decided I was done paying in compliments. I used to think love without limits was sainthood, I said. Turns out it's consent. He bristled the way men do when the floor plan they counted on shifts mid-party. I took a step back, not retreating, creating geometry that belonged to me. If he wanted performance, he would have to rehearse without me. A woman who stops subsidizing illusions becomes expensive to disappoint. I left him there in a room that finally refused to clap on cue. When the local station called, I went. The set was chilly and the chair too high, but the anchor had the kind eyes of someone who's watched a lot of truth. Try to behave on camera. I spoke plainly because plain is devastating when people expect drama. I told them about the box, the call, the hospital, the recording, and the arithmetic of a plan that counted me out. I didn't name him. I described behavior. I didn't cry. I let the facts do their work. Women my age understand that tears are a currency. Some people spend against you. The comments later were the kind that make your phone buzz on the nightstand messages from women who've been told they're too much or not enough, from daughters who grew up into mothers who finally asked for a chair at their own tables. The station posted the segment, and a wider world drew its own conclusions. I hadn't lit a fire. I had turned on a light. The difference is whether you want heat or clarity. I wanted both, and in that order. Alan filed in a stack that wobbled, which I found satisfying. Attempted murder in civil court fraud against the family estate, and a claim for emotional damages that felt less like revenge and more like a receipt. We also delivered the recording to the DA's office, where the woman at intake didn't flinch. Bless her, just checked the chain of custody envelope and wrote down my name with a firmness that told me I wasn't a story, I was a case. Paper is slow power, but when it moves, it drags. Subpoenas have a sound I learned they thud when they land, an echo in empty accounts. Ethan's counsel called Alan with the swagger of a man who hadn't yet listened to the file. After he did, his emails got shorter. We weren't aiming to ruin a life. We were aiming to name the ruin, and courts are built for names. I slept that night for 3 unbroken hours, which in this season might as well be a luxury cruise. Progress at my age often measures in consecutive breaths. The men who'd lent Ethan money don't send invoices. They send footsteps. I heard them on Megan's porch before she called voices that did not care about nap schedules or bedtime. So I did the most counterintuitive thing I've done. I paid. But I paid my way. Alan drafted a clean instrument, a secured loan to Megan, a lien against the house, converted into a transfer, signatures notarized with a stamp that sounded like a door closing. I met the men in daylight, 2 of Alan's colleagues nearby, and slid a cashier's check across a table that had seen worse deals. This clears him, their man said. It clears her, I corrected, and tapped the deed. He's got nothing here now. They appreciated clarity. Professionals do. Later, Megan cried the kind of tears that wash rather than drown. I told her we were done patching holes in a sinking boat. We had bought another shore. Sometimes salvation is a spreadsheet. Sometimes it's a key. That afternoon, she placed one in my palm, and it trembled like a bird. We changed the locks that evening, a metal echo that rewrote the house's memory. The new keys bit cleanly. The deadbolt sighed into place like a relief we could hear. Alan filed for an order of protection, and the judge signed quickly brisk script across a page that would keep a body from a door. I stood on the porch with Megan as the sun fell behind the maple. and felt how safety alters the air. It's heavier like a blanket, but it lets you breathe deeper. The kids slept without rolling toward the edge of their beds, and the hallway that had felt like a throat now felt like a hallway again. The next morning, a patrol car slowed by, then continued. Not intrusion assurance. We posted the order by the entryway, not as theater, as notice. Limits aren't just for people, they're for places too. I walked through the rooms and greeted them like survivors. You can rest now, I said to the walls, and maybe to myself. Rest finally sounded like a promise we could keep. He tried to outrun paperwork with pixels. The live stream started in a motel room where the art on the wall was bolted down, and so was his story. He called me confused, said I was dramatizing, said anyone could get sick from chocolates. That this was a misunderstanding turned witch hunt. The comments began like drizzle and became weather. People asked about the hospital, the timing the call that came too early with questions too exact. He smirked when they praised his composure and stumbled when they pulled receipts from the internet that weren't his to control photos of casinos, screenshots of texts, an article about my interview. Narcissism loves a mirror until the room fills with other eyes. He performed rationality while his pupils jittered. I watched in my kitchen lights off as he tried to harvest sympathy and reaped scrutiny. It is something to see a man who counted on charm discover it doesn't take credit anymore. The live stream ended without a goodbye. Cowardice always hits end meeting first. A clip of the broadcast floated everywhere by morning, trimmed to the moment that mattered. A commenter asked why, if he were innocent, he didn't sue me for defamation. He searched his face for an answer and found only time. It stretched elastic and damning. He sputtered a phrase about focusing on family, about not wanting to escalate, about lawyers being expensive. The internet is cruel, but it is also occasionally exact. Silence became his admission. That pause replayed on newscasts and phones, the dead air of a planned meeting evidence it couldn't dissolve. I didn't cheer, I made eggs, I've learned to feed myself, on days when the world decides to serve something else. Later, Alan called and said simply, we proceed. We would through courts that keep their own tempo, through filings and hearings, and days that felt like molasses and then like thunder. The question had been asked in public. The answer existed in paper and tape. We had both. The courtroom smelled like paper and old wood, and time moved with the stubborn dignity of a clock that won't be rushed. When the jury filed back in, I watched their faces the way sailors watch clouds searching for weather. The foreperson spoke, the judge nodded, and the gavel found the block with a sound that traveled through my bones, guilty. Attempted murder, endangering children, fraud. He didn't look at me right away. When he did, he tried to find the mother in my eyes and discovered she wasn't on call anymore. The prosecutor exhaled without smiling. The defense gathered their files as if order were a comfort. I stood because the bailiff asked us to, and sat because the law returned to its chair. People think verdicts are thunderclaps. They're more like doors closing in another room, final, distant, undeniable. Outside, the day was plain cars pigeons, a vendor adjusting umbrellas. Justice had landed, and yet the world continued exactly as it does, after storms quieter, clearer, and a little more honest with itself. I did not feel victorious. I felt unlatched. The tight loop my life had become, the anxious calls, the guarded visits, the calculations in every kindness loosened like a knot, finally persuaded by patient fingers. I went home and made tea in the mug I'd been saving for a morning that deserved it. The house did not change, the air did. I moved through rooms without bracing. I stood at the window and allowed silence to be weather, not warning. People expect rage to burn off after a verdict. What arrives, if you're lucky, is space. In that space, I found something I hadn't had in years: appetite, for sleep that isn't interrupted by dread, for fruit sliced just for me, for a walk that doesn't double as surveillance. I put the recording device in a drawer and shut it. I left the good plate on the shelf and decided ordinary dishes would be beautiful enough. Freedom, I learned, is made of small permissions you grant yourself repeatedly until they feel like fact. I did what women do when fire has passed through I built. The Dorothy Foundation began with a borrowed conference room and a checklist written in big letters so no one could pretend not to see it. Emergency grants, legal clinics, safe beds for 3 nights that could become 30 if needed. A phone line that someone answered at midnight with a voice that didn't hurry you. I asked retired nurses to sit at shelters with thermoses of soup. I asked a dentist to donate Saturdays. I asked a banker to explain credit like it wasn't a riddle. We published a 1-page guide for older women titled, "Your Name Belongs on Everything." The first checks we cut were small and miraculous utility bills. Prescription refills locksmiths at dusk. The first thank you notes were shaky and fierce. A woman arrived with a suitcase and left weeks later with a lease a phone plan in her name and a posture that didn't apologize to the hallway. I named it for the part of me that refused to die. Foundations need anchors. Mine was survival. Thursday afternoons became sacred chairs in a circle, a plate of cookies no one had to share, and a rule that the door would not judge you. We called it Circle of Strength because group therapy sounded like diagnosis, and this felt like a gym. We lifted what was heavy together. Every story arrived with a wound and left with a scab. One woman practiced saying no until it stopped shaking. Another brought the stack of bills she was ashamed of and watched them sort into solvable piles. We clapped for paperwork. We clapped for naps. We clapped for the first time someone said, "I don't need to explain." I learned that healing is noisy in the gentlest ways. Tissue boxes rustle pens, click, someone laughs at the wrong time, and we let it be right. I brought tea and sat like a student in a class. I'd needed my whole life. The scar on my own story knit itself not invisible, but smooth enough to touch without bleeding. Scars don't vanish, they integrate. Megan enrolled in night classes with a backpack that made her look 19 again, and I watched determination replace the old particular fear that had lived in her shoulders. She studied human behavior the way she had once studied coupons, deliberately hungrily, with highlighters that left trails of color through dense text. I babysat happily, and the kids learned that homework can be a family sport. On Fridays, she would sit at my table and translate theories into our language. Boundaries are love. Enabling is secrecy with nice manners. Accountability is the only apology that grows roots. When she graduated, we didn't make speeches. We framed her license and hung it in the intake room at the foundation. So the first thing women saw was proof that surviving can become vocation. We moved from being people something happened to into people who happen to something policy. Practice culture. I got good at speaking into microphones. She got good at listening between words. Together we closed the distance between pain and purpose. Hannah learned to make grilled cheese without burning the edges. Lucas learned the difference between fear and intuition, and the house learned how to hold sleep again. They decorated their rooms with posters and small rebellion string lights, a lava lamp, a plant someone remembered to water. Laughter found its way back into hallways that had once hoarded whispers. I taught them to scramble eggs and to spot a lie by its need to hurry you. We planted a basil pot on the sill and cheered the first leaf like a new cousin. Safety doesn't make life dull. It gives life permission to be ordinary in ways that feel extravagant. The doorbell became a doorbell again, not a threat. The sound of keys turning belonged to us. Some nights we watched a movie and fell asleep before the plot got smart. In the morning, we rewound without apology. That is what I wanted for them, boredom enough to be childhood rules that felt like guardrails and a grandmother whose smile didn't flinch. 5 years later, I sat in another courtroom, not for a verdict, but for a possibility. He had earned the right to ask for early release. I had earned the right to say no. My statement was short because brevity honors the past better than performance. I told the board that accountability is not a calendar, that remorse measured by paperwork still has to match the harm it seeks to answer. I talked about the children's sleep, about the way safety rearranges a brain, about the community of women who now stand because I did. He spoke the words men are taught to say when gates are involved. I watched not his mouth, but his eyes where stories refused to obey scripts. After deliberation, the decision arrived with the same steady formality as before denied. Relief doesn't cheer, it exhales. We walked out into a day that asked nothing complicated of us. On the steps, Megan squeezed my hand. We went for sandwiches and ate them like a celebration we didn't need candles for. The letter came in prison stationery, a blue line that tried to tame his handwriting. He used phrases designed to unlock old doors. I've reflected I was in pain, I see now. He asked for a chance to repair what can't be replaced. Between the paragraphs, I felt the tug of an old choreography. Cast himself as wounded, invite me to be savior. Rewrite the crime as a misunderstanding between two people who loved poorly. There were sentences that sounded nearly right, like a song I used to hum before I learned its lyrics were wrong. I put the pages down and listened to my body. My jaw tightened, my shoulders lifted, my pulse climbed ladders it hadn't needed in years. That is how I knew apology can be a tool or a weapon. This one was sharp. I brought it to Megan, to my therapist, to the circle. We read aloud until the seams showed. Intent, we agreed, is measured by where the story places the victim centered or in the margins. I wrote back on plain paper in a steady hand that belonged to the life I'd built. I thanked him for writing. I told him I had pursued my healing deliberately and that it did not require proximity to the source of the injury. I said I wished him peace that did not depend on my presence or my pardon. I spoke about forgiveness the way we teach it at the foundation as a practice you do privately often for yourself, never as a ticket someone else can demand. I did not explain, defend, or persuade. I ended with a sentence that felt like closing a window. I had once kept open in all weather I will not be visiting. I signed my full name, not the title he used to hold. I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and felt the old choreography reach for me and miss. When it left my hand at the mailbox, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt appropriately located inside my own life. News traveled the way news does in communities, built by women quietly accurately with casseroles that say what words shouldn't. A call from the warden, a clinical voice, a phrase finished with a period. He had died of a heart attack in his sleep. I sat down because the body knows what to do with impact. I did not cry for what had been. I mourned what never was. The irony didn't escape me. He had scripted my death as gentle and stolen by the heart. His arrived that way without my consent. I made a cup of tea and let it go cold. Later, I walked to the park and listened to children argue about turns on the swings, a righteous, ordinary quarrel. Megan came by with the kids. We told them news in language that respected their age and our history. That night, I wrote one sentence in my journal. Some stories end without permission. Mine continues by design. Then I slept. It was deep and undecorated. At 80, I prefer verbs to anniversaries. We have shelters in 3 cities now, a legal fellowship named for a woman who arrived with a bruise shaped like a doorknob and left with keys of her own. Hannah is learning case law. Lucas can fix a leaky sink without swearing. The basil plant is a small tree we keep cutting back to keep it generous. I teach workshops called Boundaries for the Tender-Hearted and wear shoes that don't apologize for carrying me safely home. When people ask about legacy, I don't talk about money. I talk about the map of lines I drew around my life and how that cartography became a lantern for others. The older I get, the simpler the math love plus limits equals dignity. Anything else is a loan shark's call in at midnight. I stand at my kitchen window and watch the city blink. Somewhere a ribboned box is being opened. Somewhere a woman chooses herself first, and the world is better for it. The day I drew a line, I stepped back into my own life. Not with a shout, but with a sentence no more. No more gifting my peace to keep the room comfortable. No more confusing endurance with love. Apology with change or silence with safety. Boundaries were not a wall. They were a door I finally locked from the inside and opened on purpose. On one side of that line lived dread checking the phone, bracing for footsteps, rationing myself to be consumed more slowly. On the other side lived breath-morning tea that stayed hot, laughter that didn't ask permission, sleep that didn't negotiate. I did not become harder. I became specific. I did not stop loving. I stopped leaking. The world did not applaud. It adjusted. And in the quiet that followed, other women found their voices, then their keys, then their names on their own paperwork. If you need a rule to carry with you, let it be this: love plus limits equals dignity. Start small if you must. Draw one line, stand on your side. Watch your life return to you step by steady step.